Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about a book I finished called Mexico, A Biography of Power by Enrique Krauze. Here's the book. It's a thick one. It's, 800 pages. Took me I think it took me a month to read this. This is as big as they get. This is a challenge because it covers the years from, 1810 to 1996. I think that's like 180, 190 years. It's a substantial book. You're covering a wide swath of historical time. And wow, it really shows because Mexico really came a long way in those almost 200 years. See, of course, we know about the indigenous Indians of Mexico. Cortez from Spain came in and conquered Mexico. Spain was ruling Mexico, and then around 1800 things began to change and the Mexicans began to take control of the country. But it was a very, very slow process. So it wasn't like the American Revolution where it was just over in a few years and then the new country was established. This was Mexico, and it was a much, much slower, I call it a slow motion revolution, what happened in Mexico, because I'm going to go over it, but it took a while. And there were many leaders, and some of them were some of them began very honest, but became corrupt later on. Krauze begins the book by establishing bringing us up to date from the Spanish conquest. And one of the things that you must understand is the different classes that were established from the very beginning of the Spanish conquest. And that is, you have the Spaniards in Mexico who were born in Spain. Then you have the Spanish who were born in Mexico but to Spanish parents. These are called Creoles. Then you have the Mexicans who are mixed. They are one Spanish parent, which was mostly the men, and then they had an Indian mother, and these are called mestizo. They're half Spanish, half Mexican, born in Mexico. That's called mestizo. Then you have pure Indians, an Indian mother and an Indian father. But there was a very, I'm going to say, rigid class structure that was, the upper class looked down on the lower class. They took advantage of the lower class, and that is a initial establishment of the inequality between the classes from the very beginning. Now, the Spaniards appropriated the land from the Indians, and they created these haciendas, which were, at one point, there were 6,000 haciendas in Mexico, and where the upper classes would control the haciendas and take advantage of the mestizos and the Indians. In these situations, there were kind of like little small communities where the person who ran the hacienda, had control of everything. It was kind of, controlled the lodging, the education. If there was any education, they controlled the laws. It was their own little society. So there was just. But as the years progressed, the mestizos began to criticize the authorities, but it took a long time. They were ignored, and the only way to do anything was to do it through violence, for the mestizos to organize in little militias and to fight back with violence in order to establish any type of respect and establish any rights within this very rigid conservative system. One of the most interesting ones here is Vicente Guerrero was a black Mexican. There was a very small percent of Mexicans who were from Africa, and he was one of them, and so he has a African background, and he was a military leader and grew to be president for a short time, and he abolished slavery in Mexico. And that leads me to my next point, which is that most of the leaders in Mexico, the presidents, were all military men. They all rose up in the military skirmishes, and they're all battle tested. That establishes a type of leader who likes hierarchies, doesn't like criticisms. Some of them can be very strong and cruel, and so that's an important part of the Mexican politics. Now, when you think of the native Indians, they were kind of the way that Krauze describes the native Indians is that they were just kind of stunned by the Spanish conquest, and they still hung to their gods. In some cases, they hung to their original language, and so they were kind of without a spirit inside of them driving them to please the god, worship the god. Without that initial spirit, they just lacked motivation, and they had vices. They had a spiritual deprivation. Their whole community structure was destroyed. They were used to a communal lifestyle rather than the imported Spanish capitalist system. So the basic structure is that he goes through all these presidents and does biographies of them, and so that's the way you move forward in this. So, he states in the beginning that he's not doing a great man view of history, but it is all these men, and a few of them are great, but some of them are really bad, and some of them are kind of in between. He does include like Emiliano Zapata, who was called the mystic of the land, and he was never president, but he had for a long time he had a very substantial influence on politics. But he distrusted politicians so much that he never wanted to be the president. One of the things that Krauze establishes too is that some presidents were considered liberal, which is also called the party of progression and generosity, and the other party was the conservatives, which are considered traditional, and the party of repression. So you're going to see the difference between the two. The conservative leaders more likely to be authoritarian, tyrant, and sometimes a dictator. And one of the first presidents that we talk about is Santa Anna. Now he's called kind of an opportunist, and he switched sides, and he had a long reign from 1833 to 1855, and he was involved in the wars in Texas with the independent Texans, and he lost that war, and then Texas joined the United States. He was president during the time when the United States admitted, acquired, and purchased the Mexican territory that pretty much was the states of California, Utah, Nevada, Texas, some of Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico. He was president, and he lost a significant amount of Mexican territory. So. And though he ruled for such a long time, he would not let go of power. He served 11 terms as president. And after him, other presidents had to establish that they were for one-term presidencies. But even that took a long time to come to fruition, where a president would only limit themselves to one term. But Santa Anna abused his presidency and clung to power. The next one I want to talk about is Benito Juarez, and he was a pure Indian, the first pure Indian to become president. He was well liked, of course, by the Mexicans. Probably not liked by the upper classes. And he was a significant figure in resisting the French. There's a hilarious story where Mexico was in a weakened state, and the French came in and assigned Maximilian to be the leader of Mexico, and it's one of the funniest stories I've ever read in history. So, and I want to read more about that. Benito Juarez regained power of Mexico and executed Maximilian. Then we'll move on to Porfirio Diaz, president. He was from 1876 to 1911. He's conservative, considered a dictator. He did modernize a lot of Mexico, like transportation, communication, and some businesses. But he was also would not tolerate criticisms and would violently punish critics. There was a significant issue with, like I said, the haciendas, where the native Indians felt that that land had been stolen from them, and they wanted it to be redistributed to where it belonged. And that became a constant cry of the native Mexicans to balance out the inequalities in land ownership. Then there was Francisco Madero from 1911 to 1913, and he was a very well-educated Mexican. He was educated in Europe, and he had a spiritual side to himself. He really wanted to move away from the strong man to establishing the democratic principles inside of Mexico. But because he kind of didn't have the strong man look and the strong man feel, he was opposed by those Mexicans who want the strong man. And so he had a General Huerta who was criticizing him, and Madero tried to appease him and work with Huerta, but Huerta was a disloyal and a traitor, and he, in the 10 tragic days, he did a coup d'etat. He took over the government. This general took over Madero's government, and he assassinated Madero. That's called the 10 tragic days. Huerta was only in power for about a year, and after him, Carranza came in and they established the 1917 Constitution, which laid out the democratic ideas, trying to make it permanent. You know, it just, like I said, it took a long time for Mexico to establish these democratic ideas that were established in the United States of America from the beginning, and they were respected in the United States. But for Mexico, it took a long time to get this kind of democracy going. Then you have Calles, President Calles, who was anti-clerical and did some labor and education reforms, but he was still, called Jefe Maximo. The next one I want to mention is Lazaro Cárdenas. He did the land reform. Finally, he did the land reform and redistributed some of the land and broke up the hacienda system. He also nationalized the oil of Mexico, which is such a strong resource, and the United States was taking advantage of Mexican oil. But he took the oil back, and that was even though he did that, some of his things got reversed, and it took a long time for Mexico to really establish their own control over their oil fields. Then you had some student protests that occurred in the late 1960s and violently suppressed the student protests. So in 1968, there were some protests by students against the authoritative government of President Gustavo Ordaz. The protest led to the Tlatelolco massacre of students. I found some footage here of what was going on, so you can see the chaos and the repression and the government attack on the students. That's the basics of the story of the Mexican history. Of course, there's all kinds of details, and Krauze does a great job, a comprehensive job. And though it's pretty much mostly politics, I enjoyed this book. This book was pretty much everything I would want for an introduction to Mexican history. It had enough overview, but enough details to get me acquainted with what's going on. And I can understand why a Mexican would be proud of their culture and their heritage, because they see the good Mexicans inside of their country. At the same time, when they look at their leadership, sometimes they're proud of their leadership, but they're often disappointed by their leadership, and just like we are in America. So I recommend this book if you want to read about Mexican history from 1810 to 1996. So thanks for watching.